we have a busy day today. So this morning, we're going to talk about Chapter 9 on economic growth. Okay, that will be the topic of this morning. This afternoon, we have to end a little bit before 11 because I have a meeting at 11 that I have to be at. Okay, so we'll end just a little bit before 11 so I can get to that meeting. This afternoon, we will finish up our discussion about economic growth, and then the rest of the time, it will be a review session for tomorrow's exam. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit about the structure of the exam, and then we'll have some time for those of you who have questions or, just whatever. So that, remember, the afternoon class will be on Zoom for everybody, but we'll just have an opportunity to talk about the exam. So I'll talk more about the exam this afternoon, but let me just say a couple of things. Remember, your exam is the thing we talked about last week. Okay, so we'll not include what we talked about today, but it does include what we talked about last week. I expect everybody to be here in person, right? Unless unless you're regularly online, I expect us all to be here in person. Of course, if you get sick or something like that, let me know. But if I don't hear from you, I'm going to assume that you're all going to be here in person. And the exam will be 2.5 hours, so I'll give you till 11:30 to complete the exam. I think for most of you, probably 90 minutes will probably be roughly enough, maybe a little bit more than that, but I think that's kind of the time frame I had in mind when I wrote the exam, but I'll give you 2.5 hours for that, okay? Of course, if you have accommodations, we'll work out something else, but that's kind of the basics. Talk a little bit more this afternoon about some of the details, okay? But once again, you can expect that exam to be a mix of short answers, problems, definitions, the same kind of eclectic mix that you've got in your quizzes. Okay. All right. So very quickly, anybody have any questions about anything before we get started? Okay. Well, like I said, we're going to jump right in because we have to end here a little bit early this morning. And so I want to talk about Chapter 9. All right, everyone. There's some thing on here. There we go. Okay. Okay. So. The focus of Chapter 9 here, what we're going to talk about today, is really question 1 from our syllabus. Remember, we have those big 6 questions that we're trying to talk about in this class. And so question 1 is, why are rich countries rich? Poor countries poor. And that's really what we're going to try to talk about here today, and then a little bit into I don't know whether we'll get through all of Chapter 9 today, but into future lectures, we're going to talk about why are rich countries rich and poor countries poor, right? This is an interesting question, right? In fact, you can make the argument that there's probably no question that's as important to human welfare as this question. Is there something that we could do to make poor countries richer, to make poor people richer, right? When you think about the implications for human welfare, it is staggering. It's staggering because income matters, right? Income matters. You might think, more money doesn't necessarily make you happy. I don't think there's evidence of that. But there's one thing that we know: more money allows you to live. Right? So just at the most basic level, right? Having higher incomes leads to higher quality of life because you have higher life expectancy. Today, in rich countries, The average life expectancy is 78 years. In poor countries, the average life expectancy is 47 years, almost a 30-year difference, right? So when we think about development and growth, we're not just talking about, well, would it be nice if everybody had a yacht, right? That's not really the question, right? The question is, how can we get the half of the world that's living at life expectancy of less than 50 years up to the life expectancy of places like the US, right? And so that's what we want to talk about, right? We want to talk about why growth occurs. And of course, we want to talk about the cost of growth. Growth is not a completely good thing. One of the things we have to worry about with growth is the economic or the environmental consequences of growth, right? Which is something that all of us are thinking about as we talk about climate change and more variable weather patterns, right? We'll talk about what the relationship is between growth and the environment. I don't think you'll be surprised to learn that it's a little bit more complicated than more growth is bad for the environment, right? In fact, there's an argument to be made that more growth can be good for the environment, right? And so we'll kind of talk about that. So I actually think that not only is what we talk about here in chapter 9 important, right? But it's also interesting, right? I mean, these are one of the big questions in our lives, right? About why the world looks like it does is why are rich countries rich and poor countries poor? I think this is also a really important chapter because I hope that you'll see in this chapter, you begin to see a little bit about what it means to approach a question thinking like an economist, right? And what do I mean by that? Before you read this chapter, right? If I asked you why are rich countries rich and poor countries poor, what would you say? Just throw out some ideas. If I just kind of stone cold asked you a couple weeks ago, or you asked one of your friends, why are rich countries rich and poor countries poor? What do you think they would say? Natural resources. That's a classic, right? As we're going to talk about, there's actually an argument to be made that natural resources can make you poor as opposed to rich. What else? Population, right? We'll talk about this, right? Thomas Malthus. More people make you poor because you can't feed them. What are some other things? You're probably likely to hear all sorts of stuff like culture, right? That some people just work harder than other people, or some people are smarter than other people, right? And you're likely to hear all sorts. Of course, if you listen to the news, big government makes you poor, or small government makes you poor, right? Politicians will argue that it's government that makes you rich or poor, right? Because more big government means more taxes, and taxes make you poor. There's a lot of ideas floating around there. So what do economists bring to this question? Well, we bring to this question the ability to think about it critically, and specifically to think about what are the fundamental factors that drive growth, and then what contribute to those fundamental factors, okay? So that's going to be kind of the approach we take. What's the most fundamental thing that we know about rich countries and poor countries? And then try to understand, well, where do those fundamentals come from, right? So to kind of start with a high-level view of why rich countries are rich, and then dig a little bit deeper as to why some of those big things differ across countries. So before we get into this question of why rich countries are rich and poor countries poor, let's just talk a little bit about the data. And a few facts. First thing, rich countries were not always rich and poor countries were not always poor. If we take a bigger view from history, we see that being rich is actually a relatively recent phenomenon. The world that we know really begins in the Industrial Revolution. right? The world that we know today really begins with the Industrial Revolution. So, let me show you this. Okay, hopefully you can all see this. This is just looking at per capita GDP broken into between two big groups of countries, developed countries and underdeveloped countries. And this is underdeveloped countries today. So largely this is countries that have a GDP of less than $5,000 a year. Okay, less than $5,000 a year. Just to give you some idea, the US per capita GDP is about $60,000 a year. So this is
Excuse me.
okay.
We can't see it online. It's just showing me a white box.
Yeah, can you see this?
Yes, thank you.
I don't know what's going on. So this is looking at developed countries today and undeveloped countries today. But if you went back to the year 1000, what would you see? There was really no difference between developed and underdeveloped countries, right? In fact, if we go back to the year 1000, what was the richest area of the world? Come on, history buffs. Two richest areas of the world? The Middle East and China, right? In fact, for most of human history, China has been one of the richest areas of the world, right? So the Middle East and China. What happens when we move along to the 1500s, the 1600s, even the early 1700s? Yeah, the countries that are developed today did begin to pull ahead a little bit, but the difference was not very big. It was only the Industrial Revolution. And during the Industrial Revolution, is it true that poor countries got poorer? No, poor countries got richer, or rich countries got immensely richer, right? And that's really where the distinction is today, right? That it was not that the rich countries got poor at the expense of poor countries. It's more that poor countries grew a little, but rich countries grew a lot, right? And so this world that we know today is really a product of the Industrial Revolution, right? Something happened during the Industrial Revolution where some countries took off and other countries really didn't. When we talk about poverty, most of it is in the tropics. And just to be clear, what do we define on poverty? Usually economists talk about what's called extreme poverty. This is people that are living on less than $2.50 a day. Or to put it in another way, this is per capita GDP over the year of less than $1,000, right? So you have the average person living on less than $1,000. That's what we consider to be extreme poverty. And so if you look at extreme, where extreme poverty is, right? Here's a map where the blue areas are the bluish purple areas are middle to high income countries, and the yellow and orange areas are poor to very poor countries. What do we see? Well, particularly sub-Saharan Africa, right? Sub-Saharan Africa is the biggest concentration of poverty. Also, we see some in Asia, right? But once again, mainly in the tropics, right? And what I mean by the tropics is, between the two, Tropic of Capricorn, Tropic of Cancer, right, around the equator. We tend to see a lot of poverty. We'll have some theories about why that will be here in a little bit. So notice that not every country in the tropics is poor. We have Singapore, right, Hong Kong, but there's a lot of poverty in the tropics. And then as we move to more temperate areas, we tend to get, we tend to get higher incomes. Not only are there big differences in incomes across countries, but there's huge differences in wealth across countries. So when we talk about income, as we know from talking about GDP, we're really talking about revenues over a period of time. Usually we think about income per year. But when we talk about wealth, we talk about your accumulated assets. And so once again, there are big differences in incomes across countries, but there's very big differences in wealth. So this is just looking at where wealth is, right? In three countries, the China, the India, and the United States. And so what do we see here? We see that there just is incredible distribution of wealth within countries, right? Very big differences in wealth between countries. So if you look at, this is really hard to read up here. So if you look at the United States, this is different levels of your wealth. Here is people who have less than $29,000 of wealth. That's a lot of people in the United States. There's very few people that have kind of middling values of wealth. Then what do we see? We see wealth here between, I'm sorry, that's $0 and $29. That's basically zero. And then this is 5 to 8,000, 8 to 17,000, 20 to 21,000, and then this is over $22,000 of wealth, right? So if you, maybe this isn't the clearest graph now that I look at this, to put this another way, if you look at the wealth in the United States, what the richest 22 people in the United States own as much wealth as the rest of the United States. Okay, so that just gives you some idea of the vast inequality in wealth between the United States. And you see different things in India and China, right? India, there's a lot more poor people, right? Very few people who have high values of wealth. And in China, you have more of a, I would say, an evener distribution, though of course, it's not even in the sense that 22,000 is so much more than $29, right? It's so much more. But there's big differences in wealth between countries. Sorry, my share screen just seems to be working very well today. Work. Okay, sorry, people. I don't know why it's syncing up, but it's just showing black as opposed to the usual screen. Anybody familiar with these? Any guesses as to why this would?
Maybe restart your computer.
Yeah. Well, we're not going to do that because that's going to take 15 minutes. Okay, well, I do have some notes written up. I'm going to just move to sharing my notes up here, and then we'll just kind of talk through them as opposed to using the iPad, okay? Can everybody online see this as differences in growth rates across countries?
Yes.
Okay. So the fourth question, right, that I wanted to talk about here is, or the fourth fact is that there's big differences in growth rates across countries. Okay, big differences in growth rates across countries. So when we talk about income in poor and rich, we're talking about income levels, right? The level of income. But one of the things we see is that some poor countries are actually growing fast. In other words, they're catching up with rich countries. And then we also see some rich countries that are growing slow, right? And so what this means is that countries that are rich and poor today don't necessarily have to stay that way over time, right? That a country can be rich and grow slow. It's also possible for a country to be poor and grow fast. So, here's 3 examples of the United States and China and India, right? And notice particularly China has had this big catch-up effect since 1979, right? Where in 1979, China began to grow. China has essentially averaged about 6% growth a year since the 1980s. US has averaged about 2%. As a result, China is catching up, right? India is catching up too, not at the same rate, right? Because it's growing slower than China, but it is gradually catching up. Oftentimes, these countries are referred to as growth miracles, right? And by a growth miracle, I mean a country that was poor and becoming rich. But you can also have countries that are growth disasters. And by that, I mean countries that were rich but have become poor. What are 2 examples of growth disasters? China and India. China and India were 2 of the richest parts of the world in the year 1000, and then basically fell behind slowly over the course of a century, right? Or more than a century, right? A millennium. So there's big differences in growth rates. And so what this means is that countries can become rich and they can become poor. This should raise some real questions about some of the theories for why some people have that rich countries are rich and poor countries are poor, such as culture, right? Did China change its culture in 1979? No, right? This idea that countries can move from being poor to rich without changing their culture really raises that question. It also raises the question about natural resources. China is not a country that is gifted with lots of natural resources, and they certainly didn't discover any in 1979, right? So, right off the bat, we have some questions about some of the common ideas that people have about what makes some countries rich and the key when you think about economic growth is to understand compounding. Okay, compounding is the key to understanding economic growth, because compounding means that small differences in growth rates lead to huge differences in income levels over time. Small differences in growth rates lead to huge differences in income levels over time. We're all first year, so we understand this. The rule of 70. Remember the first year seminar when we talked about the rule of 70, right, in growth rates? You guys even had this on a couple of your exams, right? Well, you guys could be mad at me during the first block because I was the person that got this in the curriculum. But now you all know it, so you should be happy with me, right? But what is the rule of 70? Remember, the rule of 70 relates to growth rates and income levels. And the rule of 70 says, if something grows at G% a year, it doubles in size every 70 divided by G years. If something grows at G% a year, it doubles in size every 70 divided by G years. Wait a second, why isn't it 100? If something, for instance, if something's growing at 1% a year, how long does it take to double in size? 70 years. Why isn't it 100 years if it's growing 1% a year? Compounding, right? Compounding. The fact that last year's growth rate grows at 1% and this year's growth rate grows at another 1% next year, right? It's the same reason why we have compounding in population, right? We have compounding, you put money in a bank and you leave it there for 100 years and you've got this astronomical amount. Why? Because interest earns interest. It's the same with economic growth. Growth begets growth in the sense that growth this year gets grown again next year. That's what the rule of 70 is helping us understand. So you can see here how this leads to huge differences in income levels over time. And by over time, I mean long periods of time, 100 years, 200 years, right? Let's say that we have two countries. Let's talk about France and let's talk about Ireland. Okay, we'll pick two countries here in the middle of this graph, France and Ireland. And we'll just drop off the tenths of a percent. France is growing at about 1%, and Ireland's growing at about 3%. And let's just say, for the sake of argument, that Ireland and France are roughly about as rich as each other. Let's say that they have, a per capita income of X. How rich is France going to be in 70 years? Relative to where they are today? France? In 70 years, France will be twice as rich as it is today. Their income will be 2x. How rich is Ireland going to be? How many times will they double the next 70 years?
Maybe 6.6.
6.6 times?
Well, not 6.6 times, but it's going to be doubled. So
No, so how long, wait, use the rule of 70. How long will it take Ireland to double?
70.
70 divided by 3 years, right? So basically a little bit over 20 years. So what's going to happen over the next 70 years? Ireland's going to double once, twice, 3 times. So at the end of the first period, they will be 2x. Where will they be at the end of the second period? 4x. Where will they be at the end of the third period? 8x. So at the end of 70 years, Ireland will be at 8x. Where's France going to be? 2x. Ireland will be 4 times richer. 4 times richer. So you can see here how there can be very big differences in income levels over time. And it doesn't, to an average person, 1% versus 3%, that's not that big, is it? Yeah, that's huge, particularly when you sustain it over time. So, as I'm going to talk about later, what's one of the, if you had to ask me, what's the most remarkable thing about the United States in terms of growth? The most remarkable thing about the United States in terms of growth is not that we've grown particularly fast over the years. But the most remarkable thing about US economic growth is we have grown pretty steadily. Unlike other countries that have had big ups and big downs, for basically 300 years, the US has grown at about 2% a year. And you compound that over decades and centuries, you begin to get really rich, right? And so that's really, in many ways, the strength of US economic performance is how steadily we've grown, as opposed to what we've seen in other countries where they've had kind of periods of high growth, but then they've also had kind of growth disaster periods. Yeah.
All I'm hearing is numbers, like period of time, so I have no idea what's going on there.
Well, it's a little hard because I can't write this up, but here, I'm going to write this up for you here.
Yeah, when you say like doubling and how long does it take to double over a period of time, I have no idea what you're saying.
Okay, so here we have France and Ireland, okay? And let's say they each have $100 of income, right? They each have $100 of income. France is growing at 1%, Ireland's growing at 3%. So how long is it going to take France to double in size, right? So in 70 years, France will double once. That'll be $200 richer, or their income level will be 200, right? How long will it take Ireland to double? 40. Right? It's going to double every 70 divided by years, 3 years. So let's see, basically every 27 years, roughly. Okay, so where's France going to be in 27 years? They'll double once. Where's France going to be in 54 years? Oh, I'm sorry, not Ireland. Ireland will double once. Where will they be in 54 years? 400. Where will they be in roughly 70 or 71 years? 800. Ireland is 4 times richer than France. Why? Because France doubled once, Ireland doubled 3 times. Right? Ireland doubled 3 times. That's the power of compounding, right? That's the power of compounding. So when economists talk about economic growth, we are not talking about going from 0% growth to 20% growth a year. That's not realistic. In fact, we're going to talk about that's not really even feasible from a practical perspective. But we are talking about what if you can increase your growth rate by 0.5% or 1% and sustain it? That's how you get rich. Right? That's how you get rich. Right? That's how you get rich. And so the differences in growth rates over time can lead to big differences in income levels. So let's now move to the why question, right? These are the facts. We know there's big differences in income. We know there's big differences in wealth. We know there's differences in growth rates. We know that there's geographical differences. Why, right? Why is it that rich countries are rich, poor countries are poor? And from the economist's perspective, it really comes down to one thing. If there is one thing that separates rich countries from poor countries, it's simply this idea of productivity. Productivity. The absolute key is productivity. what is productivity? Productivity is just the goods and services that can be reproduced by an average worker in an hour of time. In other words, how much can an average worker produce? That's productivity. Productivity is the key to becoming a rich country. Because to be a rich country, to have high income, what you also have to do, have high output. We know they're related. Aggregate income is the same as aggregate output. To have high income, you have to have high output. Now you might say, well, couldn't a country have high output by working more? Well, that is true. You can increase output by working more, but what's the limit of this in the long run? What's the limit to working more? Time, right? We only have 24 hours in a day, right? And in fact, we know this is also not the reason why rich countries are rich, because if you actually look at what people work less today than they did in the past. So it's not the fact we have not gotten richer because we work more. It has to be that we've gotten richer because we've become better at producing more in the time that we work, right? And that's what productivity is. Productivity is, if you increase productivity when you can produce more goods and services in an hour of time. The average worker can produce more in an hour of time. So you get richer when you make more in the same amount of time. So I think I told you that an average worker in the US earns in a day what an Ethiopian worker takes 2 months to earn. Why is that? It really gets down to the fact that the American worker is so much more productive than the Ethiopian worker. Right? That's at the root, at the most basic. Why do US workers get paid more? Because they make more. Because they're more productive. So there's the answer. Now, that probably should not be a completely satisfying answer to you, right? Because, okay, so rich countries are rich because they have high productivity. Poor countries are poor because they have low productivity. So then that begs the question, well, what determines productivity, right? What determines productivity? What is it that makes a rich country productive and a poor country less productive? And so as economists think about it, we really think about 3 things that matter in terms of productivity. And let's talk about each of these here. Physical capital, human capital, and technology, right? Those are the things that matter when it comes to productivity. The big 3, right? You often hear me refer to the big 3, right? These are the big 3 things that matter when it comes to productivity and income levels. And you know, I don't think that this should be very surprising to any of us. Why are US workers more productive? For really 3 reasons. First, they have more physical capital. They have more physical capital. What do I mean by that? They have more machinery. They have more equipment. They have more factories. They have more roads and bridges. They have better electrical systems. All the physical things. All the physical things that workers use to make them more productive. So for those of you who have traveled outside of the US, you observe this, right? One of the things that definitely is a big difference between rich and poor countries is the amount of physical capital that differs, right? So I used to have a little work thing that I did down in the Bahamas. And it always kind of killed me that I would get off the plane in the Bahamas, and the first thing I would do is there was a Costco in the Bahamas. So I would go to the Costco to like load up on food, and when you checked out, they were checking out like on this computer, like from the 1980s, right? Which is big screen, is like a Commodore 64, maybe you've seen it. The computer is like this big, and they're like trying to check out. And this is 90 miles from Florida, all right? It's not like I went to the other end of the earth, right? 90 miles from Florida, and it's almost like you walk back 20 years in terms of the level of physical capital that people were using, right? And as you can expect, it took me, it takes me 20 minutes to check out because it's so hard. This computer runs so slow and blah, 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 Why is that worker in Costco in the Bahamas less productive than the worker at the Costco in the United States? They have better equipment. That's certainly one of the reasons. But also, workers have more human capital. And that's the second big factor, human capital. Human capital is basically the capital that is embodied within us. This is things like education, right? We're trying to improve our human capital right here, right? Trying to learn more about the world, make us better thinkers. But human capital is more, I want to be clear, it's more than just education. It is things like experience, right? Experience can be a great teacher. Know-how, right? These things are also important parts of human capital, right? So you can get human capital in school, but you can also go work in an internship and develop your human capital background too. Or you can just work and develop human capital. And then the third is technology, right? What is technology? Technology is basically everything but inputs. Right? So in other words, technology is everything that's left over, right? If we think about physical capital and human capital as inputs into production, technology is that other bit, right? That other bit. And so, when economists talk about technology, we're talking about something very broad. We're not just talking about, I think when a lot of people hear technology, they're thinking, well, what's the new version of the iPhone? That's technology. But economists have a much broader view. Technology is invention, right? Meaning like something completely new. But it's also very importantly innovation. And what I mean by innovation is taking existing ideas and using them in different ways, right? A lot of technology growth is really taking existing ideas and using them in different ways, right? So you think about an iPhone. Actually, most of the technology that existed in an iPhone had been around for 10 or 15 years. What made an iPhone, or most mobile phones, really increase technology is not so much the individual ideas, it was the packaging of them, right? Is the taking these ideas and putting them together. And then finally, it can be things like organization, right? So you think about Henry Ford's assembly line. Henry Ford had what to us now seems like a very simple idea. Instead of having the cars in one place and moving the workers around, let's have the workers in one place and move the cars. As soon as he did that, he increased his productivity by about 40%, right? It was just simple organization, right? So organization includes things like recipes, right? Combinations, right? A lot of innovation nowadays comes from essentially the management, right? The management perspective of how you get inputs to where you need them, how do you get your workers to where you need them, right? And so that's a huge part of technology. So these three things are what determine productivity across countries, right? Rich countries have more physical capital, more human capital, more technology. So, are we satisfied with that answer? Well, maybe not, right? We'll come back to talk this in a second, but before I do that, I should say, what's not up here? Natural resources, right? One of the things that many people say, I'm kind of picking on you, but you're right. I mean, a lot of people would say natural resources. Would say, well, doesn't having natural resources make you productive, right? And you know, the thing is, no. There's lots of examples of poor countries that are loaded with natural resources, right? Probably the most natural resource rich area of the world is Central Africa. It's also one of the poorest regions of the world, right? Many people act like we're running out of natural resources. The thing is, we're not running out of natural resources. How do we know that? If we were running out of natural resources, we would see the price of these natural resources go up. What do we see? The price of these natural resources are actually pretty stable. Well, I shouldn't say stable, but haven't changed much in the long run. Yes, there are big ups and downs, but if you look at energy prices today, they're lower than they were in 1970s in real terms. That's not a world in which natural resources are the limits of growth, right? Where does this idea come from, that natural resources are the limit to growth? Well, it really comes from an economist. And the economist's name is a guy by the name of Thomas Malthus. So let's talk about Thomas Malthus here a little bit. Because thinking about Malthus is a way to kind of understand how there's more than one way to increase productivity, right? There's many more ways than just one way to increase productivity. So Thomas Malthus was a minister in England in the late 1700s. So just to put this in perspective, Malthus was writing just after Adam Smith published The Wealth of Nations. Okay, so economics wasn't really even a discipline yet, right? I mean, it was just kind of becoming a discipline of thinking. And this was really at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, right? Really at the beginning, where a lot of people really hadn't figured out what was going on. And so Malthus was a minister living in rural England. And one of the things that he got interested in is what's happening to the population in England. And he really realized that there wasn't, it's strange to say now, but really from most of human history, countries did not keep track of how many people were actually living in their country. In fact, you know, if you really want to think about it, I was just kind of reading about this the other day. You know what this idea of citizenship comes from? It really comes from war. It wasn't until we began to have national wars and countries began to conscript its citizens that they began to think about, well, who is my citizen? Who actually lives here, right? So Malthus was not just an economist, but in many ways he was the father of demographics, because in his travels he began to try to collect figures looking at what was happening to the population. Okay, and so he observed that in England, population was steadily growing. Right, the population was steadily growing. But here's the problem. What was not growing? The amount of land in England, right? Because England's an island. No way to get more land. And so Malthus made this observation. Let me see if I can share again. Work now. Yeah. Okay. Failed. So I'll try to write this up here on the board, and I hope that those of you who are taking online can read this. But Malthus made this observation that population is going up, right? Population is going up. But what's true about capital? he said capital is mainly land. Because remember, when he's writing, right, he's writing in the mid-1700s, what were most people's jobs? Farmers. And he's living in England where the amount of land is fixed, and so capital is largely fixed. And so this led Malthus to his prediction of the future. Malthus said, what's going to happen over time? If I look at the capital to person ratio, how much capital each person has, what's going to happen to this ratio over time? It's going down. That ratio is going to fall over time. And if that falls, what's going to happen to productivity? Productivity has to fall, right? Because everybody's going to have less capital per person. And if productivity falls, what's going to happen to standards of living and income? Per capita income is going to fall. And eventually, what's going to happen? If per capita income falls enough, it's going to fall below subsistence. What happens then? You have starvation, right? Malthus said the future looks like famine, starvation, famine, and big declines in the population. Of course, in everything in economics is good and bad. What's the good thing about a whole bunch of your people dying? Right? What happens to your capital per person? Your capital per person goes up, and income goes up. And so now people get richer. But of course, what happens as people get richer? They're feeling healthy, they're feeling good, they start to make babies. As they make babies, what happens to the population? The population goes up, and we're just caught in this vicious circle over and over again of population cycles. And so this is a pretty depressing view of the future, right? This is a pretty depressing view of the future. In fact, when people read Malthus's book, they said, if this is economics, then economics is a dismal science. And you still hear that phrase associated with economics, right? Economics as the dismal science. Not so much because it's boring or hard, it might be that, but because this idea that somehow economics has these really dire predictions of the future. And that really comes from Malthus. What was wrong with Malthus? What did Malthus get wrong? Is this the way the world works? What was the population? Any guesses? What was the population at the time that Malthus wrote? World population, about 1 billion people, less than 1 billion people. What's the world population today? 7+ billion people. Are we all living at subsistence levels of income? Some people are, but not most of us. What did Malthus miss? Right, productivity is not just about physical capital, right? It's also about human capital and technology. And so Malthus really saw a world in which capital was the only way that you could increase productivity. But we know that that's not the only way to do it, right? That's not the only way to do it. You can also increase productivity through human capital, right? Figuring things out, right? Figuring out new farming techniques, figuring out new ways to plow land, figuring out things like fertilizers, right? And then of course we've done this through technology, through genetic and, through genetics, right, to improve the stock, through inventing things like combines. I mean, in 1,000 ways, right? We've changed the technology and the human capital associated with farming. And some of you are probably from Iowa, or for those of you who are not in Iowa, I encourage you that if you ever get a chance, it is fascinating to go to a farm, right? It's really fascinating to go to a farm because for any of you who are city folk, you might have a conception about how a farm works until you actually go and you see that it's actually fairly technologically advanced, right? I had never been to a dairy until about 3 weeks ago, right? Where I went to a dairy not too far from here in Anamosa, the biggest dairy in Iowa, and was really pretty amazed at all the technology involved in this, right? Including, suctions that hook onto the cows, and as soon as the cows have been, milked to the exact right amount, because you do not want to over milk a cow, but they can sense what's the exact right amount, and then they just drop off, right? And 100 other little ways that technology has changed in farming, right? All these things have greatly increased productivity, right? And they have nothing to do with capital. And so, I think as we're going to talk about here, there's many ways to increase productivity. There's many ways to increase productivity. And in fact, what has history shown us? Of these three, which is the most important? Which plays the biggest role? Physical capital, human capital, or technology? Technology, by far, is the biggest one, right? Technology is the most important of these three. Why? The great thing about technology is there are not the same physical limits with technology as there are with human capital and physical capital. The beautiful thing about technology is you can essentially, in theory, grow this without limits. There is no limit to the creativity of the human imagination. With human capital and physical capital, there are some certain physical limits, right? For instance, in human capital, listen, until we can significantly expand our lives, it's going to be hard for people to spend much more time in school. I mean, as somebody who basically was in school until I was 26, that's a big chunk of our lives, right? It's hard to expand human capital because of the time that it takes. It's hard to expand physical capital because it takes resources to do that, big resources. But technology, in many ways, is much more pliable, right? A lot of technology doesn't require many resources. It just requires human creativity, right? Human creativity. So think about what we call an aggregate production function. Right? And I wish I could draw this up here on the board. But what is a production function? Down here on the horizontal axis, we put capital per worker, right? How much capital you have per worker. And here on the vertical axis, we have output per worker. Capital per worker and output per worker. So what happens if we increase our capital per worker? Will output per worker go up? Yes, right? But here's a very important insight. If I increase my capital per worker, output per worker goes up, but it goes up at a diminishing rate, right? It goes up at a diminishing rate. And this is the concept that we call diminishing marginal returns. Okay? So in your notes, put a star by this, an exclamation point, a happy face, if you have stickers or whatever you do to remember something. Diminishing marginal returns, because here is a crucial concept from this class. Diminishing marginal returns. As the quantity, it's defined as when the quantity of capital rises, the change in output from additional unit of capital falls. As the quantity of capital rises, the change in output from an additional unit of capital falls. Or to put it another way, it's hard to grow by only increasing capital alone because of diminishing marginal returns. It's hard to grow by increasing capital alone because of diminishing marginal returns. So let me just tell you a story, right? To maybe illustrate what's going on here, and then we'll come back and talk about the details a little bit more. But here's my story. Let's say that I buy 1,000 acres, and I'm going to farm those 1,000 acres. Okay? So I buy the land. First day, I show up. Got nothing, just me. And I'm just digging around in the dirt with my hands. What's my productivity? Pretty low, right? Pretty low. What happens if I then go to the hardware store and I buy a shovel the next day? Come back. What's happened to my productivity? It's going up a lot, right? And then I go and I buy a plow and a horse. What's happened to my productivity? It's going up, right? As I add more capital, my output per worker is going up, right? What happens when I buy a combine? Yeah, right now that's a big increase in capital. It's probably also going to lead to a big increase in output per worker. I go buy a tractor, okay? Initially, when I add more and more capital, I get big returns from that, right? But then there comes a point where my returns start to level off, right? Like what happens if I go buy a second tractor? I mean, yeah, that might help a little bit, but I really only got 1,000 acres, right? It's not going to help me that much, particularly when it's just me, right? When it's just me, there's not much I can do with that extra tractor. It will help some. The first tractor breaks, right? I have the second one, but it's not going to help nearly as much. So what happens as my amount of capital per worker goes up and up and up? Will it still increase output? Yes, but by smaller and smaller amounts. That's what diminishing marginal return says. So notice here that when you add the first $20,000 of capital, output goes up by $30,000. That's awesome. But what happens when you add the next $20,000 of capital? Output only goes up by $20,000, right? It's going up by a smaller amount. What happens if you add another $20,000? Now output's only going up by $10,000, right? It increases output, but it increases output by a smaller amount. That's what diminishing marginal returns is. So this is a crucial insight into the way that the world works. Can you grow only by increasing capital? It's hard because of diminishing marginal returns, right? You can increase capital a lot, but eventually you're going to really start to hit diminishing marginal returns, and it's going to get harder and harder to increase output. What's the beautiful thing about technology? It doesn't have diminishing marginal returns in the same way. And so that's really, at essence, why technology is more important than capital. Capital has diminishing marginal returns, right? There's limits, but technology does not have the same limits, right? Does not have the same limits. And so this really gives us big insight into why, rich countries, well, I won't get that far ahead of myself yet, right? But this gives us a lot of insights. Let's talk about some of these insights. Okay. Because understanding diminishing marginal returns gives us some really important insights into the way that the world works. First off, countries can't grow forever by increasing capital alone. There's real limits to the amount that you can grow by simply increasing capital. This is one of the reasons why foreign aid has largely failed to work across the globe. And we're going to come back and talk about this later. But particularly in the 60s and 70s, there was this idea that somehow what rich countries need to do is they need to go give a lot of capital to poor countries. And that will make them more productive and that will make them richer. And by and large, that completely failed. Right? So countries went into places like Africa and they built roads and they built bridges and they built dams. And they're like, once we've built all these bridges and dams, then this country's going to start growing. And what happened? Nothing. Right? There's a lot of reasons for that, but one of them is the fact that capital has to be more, or growth is about much more than just capital alone. The second part of this, though, is just as important. What tends to happen as countries get richer? They tend to grow slower. As countries get richer, they tend to grow slower. Why? Diminishing marginal returns. Right? Diminishing marginal returns. As countries get richer, they tend to grow slower. Let me put this another way. If I had a tractor, where is that tractor most likely to have the biggest impact on productivity? If I give it to an Iowa farmer or I give it to a Mexican farmer? Everything else being equal, right? Probably the Mexican farmer, right? Because what's true about most Iowa farmers? They're loaded with capital. They've got a lot of capital, right? In fact, I don't know of an Iowa farmer who doesn't have a tractor. Well, maybe a very small Iowa farmer, but for the most part, Iowa farmers have lots of capital at their disposal. If I give the typical Iowa farmer another tractor, he's not going to say no, but it's unlikely to increase his productivity a great deal at this point. But if you take it to a poorer country where capital is scarcer, it's more likely to increase productivity. This is the reason why poor countries, when they start growing, can tend to grow very fast. Because once they start increasing capital, it usually has huge benefits, right? So think about, if I go back to this graph here a second ago. What happened is I moved from 0 to 20,000 in capital. My output went up a ton, right? When poor countries start to grow, they often grow really fast. But what happens is you get richer and richer. Then your growth starts to slow down, right? That's not a bad thing. That's not a bad thing. That's actually a sign of success, right? Richer countries tend to grow slower than poor countries. That's a sign of success. So, ceteris paribus, you would expect to see poor countries grow faster than rich countries. Why? Because of diminishing marginal returns. And so there is a sense in which convergence is possible, right? And by convergence, I mean countries moving towards the same income levels, right? If rich countries are growing slower and poor countries are growing faster, over time they should catch up. If I go back to this graph, this is convergence, right? Look what's happening to India and China. They're converging with the US. Slowly, very slowly. I mean, this is not going to happen in our lifetimes. But if these paths continue, yeah, there will be a day where China and India converge with the US because they're growing faster. Why? Largely because of diminishing marginal returns. Of course, what's going to happen as China and India get richer? Their growth is going to slow. And this is already happening in China, right? Their growth rates are already slowing as they get richer. Yeah.
Computer's about to die.
The what?
Computer's about to die.
Thank you. Boy, this has been a technology nightmare today. Thanks. Hopefully that helps some. I'm going to dim my screen a little bit, hopefully. Yeah, we'll see. Now, the thing about convergence, though, is it is not happening for everybody. Yes, it is true that some countries are converging, but other countries are not converging, right? So this is looking, these graphs are a little complicated, but they're looking at how rich you were in 1955 and then how fast you've grown since 1955. If we look at rich countries, what's true? The countries that were poor in 1955 have grown faster, and the countries that were rich in 1955 have grown slower. That's convergence, right? Among rich countries, we do tend to see convergence. But if we look among the world as a whole, we don't see convergence. In other words, Africa was poor in 1955, and they've also not grown in 1950. That's very fast since 1955. So yes, it is somewhat true that poor countries grow faster, but it doesn't have to be true. There's lots of exceptions to that, and we'll talk about the reasons for these exceptions later. So diminishing margin returns. I think about diminishing margin returns every time I hear an idiot politician say something like, you know, the US can grow like China's growing. Can the US grow like China's growing? Well, I mean, we could take a bunch of bombs out and blow up all of our capital. And what happens if we blow ourselves back 30 or 40 years? We'll start growing, we'll start accumulating capital, we'll grow fast, right? Is that a good economic policy? No. Let's not be confused. Is the objective of economic policy to grow fast? No, it's to be rich, right? I would prefer to be rich and growing slow as opposed to being poor and growing fast, okay? So diminishing marginal returns is not a negative thing, it's just the way the world works. In some sense, slowing growth is a sign of success, right? And so this happens, and this is happening in China right now. Growth in China the last decade has been slower than it was for the previous 20 or 30 years. That was completely predictable, right? As China gets richer and accumulates more capital, the role of capital is getting smaller and smaller. And so what happens is that really when capital becomes ubiquitous, that really is increasing the role of technology, right? And so in other words, to put this in another way, if you look in the United States, and if we can kind of break how growth occurs, About 40% of growth is caused by increases in physical capital, and about 10% in human capital. Human capital is really hard to increase, right? Because education is really expensive and it's time consuming. But half of growth is because of total factor productivity, or what we call technology. What does technology allow us to do? Think about it this way. Technology shifts that curve upwards. That curve, that production function that we had a minute ago. Every time we have new technology, it shifts that curve up. It means we can produce more output now with the same amount of capital. So before, when I had $20,000 of capital and I produced 30,000, now with an increase in technology, I can produce 60,000. I can produce twice as much. Same for at 60,000, right? Before, in 1945, I could maybe produce 60,000 in output. Now I can produce twice that much. That's what technology does. With the same amount of inputs, I can produce more. That is really the most important factor in getting rich, right? Rich countries are better able to use technology to increase production. So I told you about that, the Costco in Bahamas, right? I mean, some of that was capital, that they had an old-fashioned computer, but I think it speaks to a deeper problem about technology, right? About their ability to borrow or use existing technology from other parts of the world, right? And we'll talk about why sometimes countries have a hard time increasing technology. But if you don't think technology is amazing, here's this fact, which I think about all the time when I go up to Wisconsin. Wisconsin cows produce 2.5 times the amount of milk that they did in 1980, right? That is innovation and technology, right? The same cow. Yes, there's been changes in genetics, but not that much because they don't happen very quickly. But out of the same cow, you can get 2.5 times more milk, right? That's all about technology, right? That's all about the thousands of little ways. And sometimes technology is the big things, but most often it's all the little things that take place over time to allow you to get more output with the same amount of inputs. Unfortunately, and this is a topic that we could spend a lot of time on, but economists don't really understand technology that well. I don't want to say that we don't understand it. In fact, there's a lot that economists understand a lot, but we struggle to kind of figure out how technology exactly changes productivity, right? We struggle with identifying exactly how technology changes productivity, right? So for instance, I want to show you this graph. This is looking at our measure of technology, right? How technology has grown over time. And notice that there's all these ups and downs in it. After the war, between 1948 and 1973, productivity growth was 2.2% a year, or technology growth was 2.2% a year. Then it went down, then it went up, then it went down. Now there's some signs that it's going up again. What's going on? In brief, economists really struggle to understand this, right? We struggle to understand this, in part because there's oftentimes huge, long lags between when there's new ideas and when that actually begins to change productivity, right? So, oftentimes you think about the personal computer, right? The personal computer had probably existed for at least a decade before people had figured out, hey, I can use this thing to do my accounting, or I can connect my personal computer to other personal computers through the web, right? I don't want to ramble too much. Just say this is complicated, right? This is one of the things that economists really struggle to understand, is how technology changes over time and how this impacts the economy, right? And, think about this. As things like social media increase productivity or decrease productivity, right? We think of social media as like a new technology or relatively new technology. Has it increased productivity? Maybe. Could it have decreased productivity? Quite honestly, yes, right? I don't know if if social media has increased my productivity or decreased it. In some ways, it's done both. And so, that just goes to show you that the relationship between technology and growth, we know that it's important in the long run, but like, how do we connect the dots in the short run? That's a complicated thing. That's a very complicated issue. Okay, so let's pause here and take a step back and think about where we've been. We've talked about the fact that there's a lot of disparity across the globe in income levels, in growth rates, and geographically, and in wealth, right? Lots of disparity. How do we explain that? By differences in productivity, right? Rich countries have high productivity, poor countries have low productivity. What determines a country's productivity? 3 things. What are those 3 things? Human capital, physical capital, technology. Of those 3, which is the most important? Technology, right? Of those 3, technology is the most important. That's what we've got to here in the first hour and 20 minutes, okay? Now, let's try to dig a little bit deeper, okay? Why does physical capital and human capital and technology differ across countries? Right? Why is it that in the Bahamas they're using computers from 25 years ago? Right? What is it? What's the barrier? Right? What is it? Why is it that some countries seem unable to accumulate physical capital and other countries have it at the ready? This is definitely a deeper question, right? This is a deeper question. This is going to ask us to think harder about the way that the world works. But if you ask economists, why is it, right? Why is it that these 3 things differ across countries? Their answer can largely be boiled down to a single concept, the concept that we call institutions. And so once again, here is another big star or exclamation point, something that's absolutely crucial for us to understand from this chapter. What economists mean by institutions. Institutions, where we define this as the incentives created by governments and societies to engage in productive behavior and not expropriative behavior. Expropriative is a fancy word for steal. Institutions are the incentives created by governments and societies to engage in productive behavior and not expropriative behavior. Or to put this more simply, to what extent does society encourage you to make or to take? To what extent does society encourage you to make or to take? If your society encourages you to make, you will have productive institutions and you will accumulate physical capital, human capital, and technology. To the extent that your institutions encourage people to take, you will not have those things. Okay, so let me explain this thinking here a little bit more. to a very large extent, and this is one of the things that's always appealed to me about economics, is that economics really assumes that everybody is basically the same kind of people, right? That regardless of your culture, your location, your time in history, people basically are people. They respond to incentives. Incentives meaning benefits and costs. To the extent that the benefits are in making things, then people will accumulate physical capital, human capital, and technology. To the extent that all the incentives are towards taking things, then people won't make, they'll just take, right? So economists basically view people as entrepreneurs in many senses. And in fact, one version of economic history is just a series of entrepreneurs, right? What's the difference between Genghis Khan and Jeff Bezos? They're just entrepreneurs. They're just entrepreneurs, right? Why did Genghis Khan, go out and conquer and pillage and kill what today would essentially be 500 million people? Could he have just set up a little yurt and have a little shop and sold little goods out of his shop, handcrafts and things? Is there a lot of money to be made in that in the 13th century? No, you set up a shop and what's going to happen? Someone's going to come along and take it from you, right? So how do you get rich? You take their stuff before they take your stuff, right? I mean, all of the incentives to society were organized around taking, right? Taking. What about Jeff Bezos? You think Jeff Bezos has ever woke up in the morning and say, you know what? This is how I'm going to make my money today. I'm going to jump on a horse and I'm going to grab my sword and I'm just going to ride around Silicon Valley hacking people to death. You think, yeah, actually, maybe that's not a good example. Maybe Jeff Bezos actually does wake up. But in general, is there a lot of money to be made from pillaging, at least in the United States? No, right? Because all of the incentives, well, I shouldn't say all, most of the incentives in our society tend to encourage making as opposed to taking. That's not to say that you can't make money taking, but a more reliable way of making money is to make, right? To make things. And so that's really what creates the incentives for people to invest in physical capital and human capital and technology. They have to have the payoffs. If your society doesn't give them the payoffs, they won't do it. So can your society give them the payoffs? That's really the big question. This is the trillion-dollar question. When we think about why rich countries are rich and poor countries are poor, the deepest reason is this: incentives, right? Incentives and institutions. To what extent does your society encourage people to do the things to make them rich? Or what extent does your society encourage you to steal things from people? So when we talk about institutions, what are things that matter? How do societies encourage people to make instead of take, right? Well, I think there's a number of things that governments and societies do, right? And let's talk about some of these things. First, very importantly, protecting property rights. Protecting property rights. And by that I mean individuals can own property and they can keep the returns that are generated by it. Can you keep the returns from your labor and from the capital that you accumulate? Or will somebody just come along and steal it, like the government? So if I ask you all, what caused the Industrial Revolution? Or what started the Industrial Revolution? What's the answer you learned in high school? War?
Stable market.
Stable market. Well, you had a good teacher. If that's what you learned. I'll tell you what I learned. I learned that it was the steam engine. It was the steam engine. Do you know that the Romans had steam engines? The Romans had steam engines, right? What did they do with them? Use them to open and close doors, right? Having technology is not the thing that started the Industrial Revolution. Most of the technologies that existed at the time of the Industrial Revolution had existed previous to the Industrial Revolution. So what is it that changed? Well, the argument of many economists was a change in property rights, a change in the way that government viewed their relationship with individuals, right? So we know that the Industrial Revolution started somewhere in the mid-1700s. There was the big change that was going on in the 1700s was an intellectual change about the relationship between the person and the state, right? You think about all these things that happened in the mid to late 1700s. The Declaration of Independence, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the American Revolution, the French Revolution, Adam Smith, David Hume, right? All of these things emphasize the right of the individuals and said that government's rights don't supersede the rights of individuals. Individuals have the right to happiness and the pursuit of happiness, right? Which is really talking about private property, right? So those of you who've taken, history courses of medieval times, you know this, right? Where was the idea of private property in the 1400s? It didn't exist, right? People were tied to land, right? They didn't own anything. The landowners owned something. And even the landowners could have their property taken away from them by, either a king or a queen or an army, right? In most parts of the world. And so as long as that occurred, what was the incentive for people to innovate or to build new capital or to invest in an education? There just wasn't much incentive, right? You think about Rome. Why didn't Rome use those steam engines to make things? Well, those of you who know anything about the history of Rome know that there was only one acceptable way to make money in Rome. That was through war, right? It was slaves who made things, right? So there's this old story, I don't know if it's true or not, but the story is that the Romans actually had glass. It was invented by a slave. And when the glass got to the emperor, he said, kill that slave and make sure that we never make any more glass again. Because if people see glass, they're not going to want gold anymore. And I've got all the gold, it's good for me, right? That's the kind of thinking, right, that has tended to pervade a lot of human history. It creates very few incentives to engage in the kind of investments you need to get rich. What happened in China in 1979, right? Why is it that China started to grow in 1979? Well, it all began with a very simple change in policy. During the Communist Revolution in China, all land was essentially owned by the state, and all farming was done in terms of communes, meaning everybody farmed the same land, and whatever you produced just went to the government. Where was the incentive to innovate or to work hard? There was none, right? And so what happened in 1979, China passed the household responsibility system. And basically what the household responsibility system was is now you can farm your own plot of land. The government still owns the land, but you can farm it. And some of it you give to the government, but anything you produce over and above this amount, you get to keep. That absolutely changed the incentives for farmers. And so what did farmers see? Productivity went way up. As productivity went up, more people didn't have to become farmers. More people could move to cities, begin to work in factories. That was the beginning of a long, complicated process of economic development, right? So changing institutions, right? Oftentimes just means letting people keep the benefit of their hard work. Right? That's what we mean by property rights. I got a whole list of things here. Let's kind of talk about some of these whole list of things. And of course, this is not an inclusive list, but these are just some of the things that economists have identified as important in terms of shaping institutions. Next, having political, legal, and economic stability. Right? Basically having stable government. Having stable government that can enforce laws, make sure that somebody doesn't come and rob you blind. If you enter into a contract, that you can get that contract enforced, right? The rule of law. The rule of law. Right? That's a phrase that's often used, but the rule of law is a very important part of becoming rich. Because what you do is you tend to keep corruption low, you keep regulation low. What this means is that people then are better able to make, right? They're able to spend more of their time making, and they can spend less of their time paying bribes, right? And it encourages people to spend less time trying to take bribes. There's so much to be said about this across countries. I mean, honestly, on each one of these things, I could talk for hours, right? Because there's so much to be said for the role of political and legal stability in economic growth. But let me just give you one example. And this example comes from comparing North America to South America and how history has shaped property rights in North America versus South America. So in North America, as you're probably all familiar with, North America was colonized by England, and it was largely colonized by individual farmers who brought their families here, right? So people from Europe came to the US. Typically, they brought their families, okay? And they set up individual small farms, right? And so that's kind of the process by which farming and economic development happened in the early days of colonization in North America. South America was much different. South America is, largely colonized by Spain and Portugal. How they set it up was not based on small individual farms, but on big haciendas owned by rich people from Europe, who basically enslaved Native American people. And when there were not enough Native Americans to enslave, they basically incentivized men from Europe to come and work, right? So most parts of South America, this is not true everywhere, but most parts of South America, people did not migrate there to stay and to bring their families. They migrated there from Europe to come make some money and leave. This is largely true of a lot of colonization in other parts of the world, right? So what happened as South America became independent, as this hacienda system broke up? You basically had a lot of people living on these farms who did not own the land that they were living on. And in the period of years since, they're still living there, and they don't formally own the land that they live on. And worse than that, the government doesn't encourage them to live on the land. Why? Because the fact that government bureaucrats have power over them is a big source of bribery and a big source of revenue for governments, right? So this all leads to this crazy figure I'm showing you here. There's no way you can read this. But what this is there's an economist by the name of Fernando de Soto. He's from Peru. And so he went through the process of, in Peru, the steps you need to go through to take land that you're living on and formally get a title to it. In other words, to formally own the land that you're living on. And so this is a graph of the process. The procedure consists of 5 stages. The first stage takes 205 steps. He estimated it would take between 17 and 21 years to get from point A to point B, right? That's crazy, right? And so what happens when people don't own the land that they live on? How does that change their incentives? Well, they probably live on their land like you guys live in your dorm room, right? Anybody thought about like building onto your dorm room or painting or fixing a big hole in the wall? You don't give a rat's ass, it's not yours, right? And unfortunately, it creates those same sorts of incentives for many farmers in South America. They don't want to improve the land because it could be taken from them. They don't want to build a house because it could be taken from them. At least they don't want to build a nice house. Even more fundamentally, they can't use the land as collateral to get a loan, right? So on paper, they're very poor because they don't, by not technically owning the land they're on, they can't use that as collateral to get loans to make improvements like most Americans would do if we own land, right? So this is just one of the ways we're not having functioning legal systems can kill incentives and kill growth, right? Just one of many ways. And for those of you who have traveled abroad, or you might be immigrants or the children of immigrants, you can probably think about your home country, and you could think of 100 examples of like this, right? Of the small ways that governments don't create incentives for people to engage in productive behavior. Likewise, many governments kill growth by just having unstable macro policy. We're not going to say much about this today, but later we're going to talk about the ways that macroeconomic policy can kill growth. We have talked about inflation, right? Remember we talked last week about the ways that variable inflation can kill finance, and not having finance can kill growth. Governments have oftentimes meddled in financial markets to make money. And to the extent that they do that, it can lead to a lot of taking behavior as opposed to making behavior. And then also having fiscal policy that's reasonable, right? Not too much taxation or spending. In Argentina, the effective tax rate on many activities in Argentina is more than 100%. So what kind of incentives does that create for people in Argentina? Well, there's really only two options, right? You don't do it, or you cheat. Those are the only two options, right? You really don't have any other option when you have tax rates that are that high. So last time I was in Argentina, in Buenos Aires, they have like a main street, main drag, it's a very big shopping area. And most of the stores would have this big sign that would say 40% discount if you pay in cash. And then they were right on the window, 40% discount if you pay in cash, right? So I was looking for a soccer jersey for my kids, so I go in there, sure enough, here's the soccer jersey. Will you pay in cash? Sure, I'll pay in cash. There's cash. I got the soccer jersey. Do I get a receipt? No, of course not. And you know why? Because they want to do it in cash so that they don't have to report it, because what's the tax? More than 40%, right? They're happy to pay in cash so they don't have to report to the government, right? Those are the kind of crazy economic policies that keep countries poor, right? Because what's the impact of that then? Well, then Argentina doesn't collect any revenue. And when they don't collect any revenue, they can't provide the services that people need and blah, blah, blah. Promoting competitive markets, right? Good governments who create good institutions will help to break up monopolies and make sure that it's not just one person running the whole country. This was a big problem that you had in the Soviet system, right? Under communism, where you essentially have central planners who would make all the decisions about what got made and how it got made. So in the Soviet system, who determined how much steel got made? A couple of guys in Moscow who would go to a factory and say, your factory's got to make this much steel. It's got to make this many tonnage of steel. And oh, by the way, if you don't meet that limit, we're going to take you out back and shoot you or send you to Siberia. All right, so what kind of incentives does that create? First off, do you want to make 1 ton steel more than you have to? No, because next time you'll be asked to make that much, right? So you don't want to make any more than you have to. And second, if the goal is to make a ton of steel, what should you do? Make the heaviest steel you possibly can. And so there's all these stories in Soviet Union of how chandeliers would always be falling out of ceilings because they were so heavy. Because the average piece of steel in the Soviet Union was so heavy, in part because it was central planners, not markets, right? Markets try to take into account what people want. Central planners think they know what people want, or they know what they want, and they tell people what to do. That tends to not create very good incentives, right? In the US, one of the big questions for us is, are we going to break up some of these big tech monopolies, right? Because it's pretty obvious that Google, Facebook, Amazon are getting very close to being monopoly. I mean, I shouldn't even say very close. They are essentially monopoly. And so one of the questions that we have to address as a society is, should we break them up? How do we break them up? How do we do it in a way that helps promote competitive markets as opposed to just breaking them up into unproductive companies or something else, right? These are the questions that countries have to struggle with. Let me talk about one more here. Yeah, I'm going to skip this one for a second. Let me talk about 2 more, and then we'll come back and finish up our discussion this afternoon. Promoting quality education, right? This is something that productive countries do.
Professor Todd,
Yes?
I thought you said you had a meeting today.
Yeah, we're just finishing this up, and then we're going to go.
Just reminding you.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate it. So promoting quality education, right? When you look at China, for instance, what's one of the reasons why China's been able to grow quickly? In part because China actually, even when it was a poor country, had a relatively good educational system. And as we talked about, human capital is really the hardest thing to increase. Of those big 3, human capital is the hardest. And so China, in part because they have a long history of education and solid educational system, this is one of the things that made China poised to develop relatively quickly. And so you can see here how China has rapidly caught up to places like Argentina, right? Once again, there's so much to be said on this. I mean, it seems kind of ridiculous to just say good education, because you probably should be asking, well, what makes for a good education? How would the US improve our educational system? There's a ton to be said about that. We just don't have time. And then finally, well, not finally, building 2 other things here. Building public infrastructure and promoting research and development. In other words, government investment. Government can be the source of important parts of capital, right? They can build roads and bridges and communication networks. And also, governments have a role in providing basic research and development, particularly research and development that does not have a direct market application. Right? Research and development that is going to immediately lead to making profits, that's the kind of things that businesses can do. But what about some of that more fundamental research, right? That's often what governments need to promote, right? So, let me just think of the example, of a couple of examples. One would be, think about basic science spending. The National Science Foundation, right? Gives a lot of money to universities to do basic research. This is not research that immediately today is going to make money, but it's the kind of thing that maybe over years will, right? Trying to promote that kind of very basic. Another way that the government tends to promote research and development is through patents. What's a patent? You basically get a monopoly on it, right? And usually that monopoly lasts between 17 and 21 years, depending upon the good. Are monopolies or patents good or bad? Well, like everything in economics, they're both. They're good in the sense that they encourage research and development, right? Listen, there's no way that the vaccine companies would have invested as much as they did in the COVID vaccine if they did think they were going to be able to make a profit at the end of it, right? And part of making a profit means not everybody's going to be able to steal your idea and make their own version of your vaccine. So, you know, something like a vaccine, that's a very good example of where patents work. But we should also be clear that there's a danger in patents. Patents also create monopolies, right? And monopolies can be misused. And one of the things that we see here, you see I have this thing called patent trolling. Anybody ever heard about what patent trolling is? So patent trolling is basically when companies buy up a bunch of patents and then they try to sue each other over violating each other's patents. And so this is basically what Apple and Samsung does every time that one of them comes out with a new phone. Samsung comes out with a new phone and immediately the next day Apple sues them. So you violated this patent and that patent and that patent. And then Apple comes out with a new phone and Samsung says, we are suing you. And we're suing you for this and that and the other. Is this really about innovation? No, it's really about stopping your competition, right? It's really non-market competition, where Apple's trying to drive Samsung out, Samsung's trying to drive Apple out so they can be monopolies. So, you know, once again, there's a lot to be said about this. I just want to make the point that, you know, just giving away patents willy-nilly to everybody is not a good idea. That's a bad idea, right? So the hard question about patents is what should be patentable and what should not. And sometimes big mistakes are made. Those of you, you're all familiar with Amazon. On Amazon, you ever notice that you can buy things with that one click, but you can't do that on other sites? You want to know why? Because Amazon patented that idea. That is about the most obvious idea you could possibly think of. Why Amazon got a patent for that? Nobody understands, but they got a patent, so no other company can use it. That's the kind of idea that's really being used to stop competition, to stop innovation. And so you gotta be careful about this, right? You gotta be careful about this. All right, there's one other thing that impacts institutions I want to talk about this afternoon before we do our review, and that is promoting international trade, but we've run out of time. So I want to talk a little bit about this afternoon, and then we will have time for our review session and talk about the agenda, okay? All right, so we'll see you back on Zoom at 12:30. Right, and hopefully I can get my iPad working.